There's a brew. Fake surgeon speed reads medical book. Does 16 surgeries? Huh? And saves everyone. This looks interesting. This could be good.
Anguished cries echo up through the metallic hallways of the HMCS Cayuga. Shivers tickle up a man's spine as he ransacks his bookshelves, searching. He skitters through the dark and gloomy room, the only light streaking in through a single, dingy porthole. Someone bangs on the door to his office, pleading that he hurry up. Hot sweat trails down his forehead as he finds the book he's looking for. He cracks it open, flipping through the pages, scanning each one, desperately committing them to memory. Below him, over a dozen injured men lie in pools of their own cooling blood. The hulking man emerges from a nearby hallway and
So this
sets out
man's
to
gonna
work
come through and
immediately,
save the day.
sewing up guts, reinflating lungs, and yanking out pieces of shrapnel. He'd hoped it would never come to this. He'd done everything he could to avoid actually operating on anyone, but now that he was here, there were no other options. In the fog of
Wait, but
war,
what happened?
when you're laying on the cold deck of a military ship and can feel your body growing colder by the minute, you don't ask the doctor who comes to save you if he passed all his exams. You don't wonder if he is who he says he is.
Sure, you just
How
kinda
would you
hope.
feel if you learned that the man you just entrusted your life to was an imposter? That he'd only
Imposter?
learned how to perform your surgery a few minutes ago from a manual? How does a fraud end up as the only surgeon of a Canadian Royal Navy ship in wartime?
Oh, it's on a Canadian Royal ship. Right. Okay. Huh. Some random dude's just playing doctor. Man's going for like an IRL operation game. This is crazy.
Weeks with Babbel. Click the link in the description to get up to 60% off your subscription. March 1951. Dr. Joseph Sear, boarding a bus in Boston heading north for St. John, New Brunswick, newly acquired documents in hand, was anxious to present himself to the Royal Canadian Navy. When he finally arrived at the recruitment office, he was tired, hungry, and nearly out of cash. But he straightened his back and announced, "I am Dr. Joseph Sear of this province, and I feel it is my duty, now that we are again in war, to volunteer my services where they can be of most help." The war in Korea had been waging for the last year, a conflict that would continue to eventually take the lives of over 5 million people, and Joe knew that the recruiter sitting at the desk in front of him would be in no position to turn away a qualified doctor. In fact, Joe was immediately whisked away to Ottawa, Canada's capital, and questioned not on his medical knowledge, but on whether or not he would use his position to experiment on wounded seamen. Satisfied that he would not practice unethically, Joe was sent back to St. John, where
They didn't even
measurements were
question,
taken for
like,
his
his-
uniform before his trip to Halifax to begin work. The
Like
other
if he was
doctors there
official
were cool
or
and
anything?
distant to him, but he later learned
Just
that
if he was
only
gonna do
because they
weird
thought he was
experiments?
Quebecois and spoke French while they all spoke English. It turns out English and French
It
people
was
dislike
wartime,
one
though,
another
so maybe
not only
desperate.
in Europe but all over the planet. Joe was eventually transferred to the HMCS Magnificent in Halifax. One day, while strolling through the streets and alleyways of Halifax, the quiet din of Dartmouth town across the harbor and under the shadow of the Citadel, he saw a woman sitting quietly among the daffodils and dandelions of a local park. Joe knelt down, plucked a dandelion, and while looking into the eyes of the young woman, struck up a conversation. "We used to play that if you could blow all the fluff off a dandelion, you got your wish," said Joe. "We used to say it meant you were in love," she replied.
Yeah, I've heard that.
No, he chided. "You hold the dandelion under someone's chin, and if it makes the chin all yellow, he's in love." She instantly reached down, picked a single dandelion, and held it gently under his chin. "Did you know you were in love?"
I haven't heard that.
Her name was Catherine.
I've heard the wish
and was
thing,
a
but
nurse
not
in the
that.
Navy. A whirlwind romance ensued. Joe knew that he had to marry her, but he couldn't until he told her his secret. A deep and dark secret that might not only destroy his chance at love, but also destroy his very freedom. Before he could summon the courage to tell her, new orders were shoved into his hand by an uncaring naval officer. He was to report to the HMCS Cayuga as a medical officer before sailing off for the coast of war-torn Korea. On board the Cayuga, Joe was immediately under scrutiny. As a new member of the officer corps on the ship, and as the person plugging up bullet wounds, the sailors aboard the destroyer had a vested interest in their new medical officer's skills.
Three Stooges.
Soon, he was called into the captain's cabin, as his new commander, James Plomer, was complaining of a terrible aching pain in a few of his teeth. Joe assured the captain that he
The
could
teeth.
remove the
Oh,
offending
man,
teeth
teeth pain
immediately,
is
but he needed
terrible.
to gather his equipment below decks. After what seemed like an eternity, the
like
captain
some of the
sent his
worst shit.
executive officer down to Joe's quarters, demanding
least
what was
that I've
taking so
experienced.
long. He assured them that his office was simply disorganized and he needed a moment longer. After some pleading from the exec, Joe returned to the captain's quarters, administered a healthy dose of Novocaine, and deftly yanked out the two clearly rotten teeth.
Oh,
The HMS Cayuga offered
Right.
close artillery support to soldiers on the ground.
Okay.
Typically, the cannons were enough to prevent
yanked
any
them
friendly
suckers out.
casualties. But one September afternoon, a Korean junk saddled up the Cayuga carrying a boatload of injured Korean soldiers. Joe was watching the ship's engine idle when an officer retrieved him. Joe looked upon the pile of bleeding men as the captain stood next to him. You willing, Joe? It is not required. But the pitiful faces of dying men, regardless of what side they were on, were enough to turn his heart, and he resolved to help them. The 19 soldiers were gravely injured and would certainly die without his help. Even if his help could only give them the slightest chance of survival, he could not sit idle. Dr. Joseph Sear
Right.
descended into a lifeless realm that cool September.
wait, so he said that all these men came from like a drunk shipmen? Is that what he said?
But one September afternoon, a Korean junk saddled up the Cayuga
A
carrying a
Korean
boatload
junk.
of injured
I thought
Korean.
he said some drunk. I thought he said some drunk like was driving boat, and then they all crashed boat. Right. Okay. I see. Okay.
Story for the Army newspaper. The officer told the doctor that his story would be an
What was it?
armless realm that cool September afternoon. His sickbay, a waiting room before the afterlife. The skipper and navigator up at the bridge, watching a storm sail toward them, desperately held the ship steady as every cry of pain echoing up from below decks reminded them of death. If they lost control of the ship, it wouldn't matter what Joe did. Those men would not survive. By the time Joe was done,
Right.
the morning sun was cresting over the horizon, the Japanese mainland stretching wide across the view from the little porthole down in the medical bay. By the end of his stint, Joe had performed 16 surgeries, including open chest surgery. He wrote a letter back to Catherine in Halifax,
Actually
hoping she
patched
would
everyone
hear of
up.
his exploits. And at the same time, he was approached by a young press officer
No
interested in a
casualties.
colorful story for the Army newspaper. The officer told the doctor that
Bro,
his
he's a
story
doctor now.
would be in Army
Like,
dispatches and would
okay.
also be shown in his hometown's local papers. Despite
That's
being
crazy.
from Grand Falls, New Brunswick, he insisted that the paper be shown in Halifax with the hopes that Catherine would
Man
see
read
it too.
one book.
At the same time, however,
And he had
in
it.
the sleepy town of
He had it.
Edmundston, a short drive north of Grand Falls, New Brunswick, another Dr. Joseph Sear was answering some phone calls. I read a newspaper in Halifax that said you saved a bunch of kids in Korea. No, not you? Your son then? At first, Joe thought it must be some perplexing cosmic coincidence. There are lots of Sears in the world, he mused. But then, after learning that he was the only Dr. Joseph Sear in the whole of Canada, and seeing a photograph of the alleged Dr. Sear, he realized the perplexing truth. Why, this is my friend, Brother John Payne, of the Brothers of Christian Instruction. The papers, without consulting the Navy, had published the article on the mystery surgeon's exploits in not only Halifax, but Toronto as well. This drew the attention of some higher-ups, and they quickly
Oh.
unraveled a spiderweb of lies that led an imposter to the position of chief medical officer on a military ship.
Now he's
The
caught.
question remained, though, who was this fake Dr. Sear? In the summer of 1950, Dr. Cecil Boyce Hammond, after leaving the law program at Northeastern Law
He's
School
been caught,
in
but he's done
Boston,
this before.
arrived at the Brothers of Christian
Interesting.
Instruction in Alfred, Maine, as a
So who is
convert
he?
with a PhD in zoology from Purdue. The monks were elated and immediately introduced him into the order. The first thing Cecil did was suggest that the brothers grow their small junior college, which specialized in teachers' education, into a full-time four-year college. The other brothers thought this was a grand idea and let Cecil take the name Brother John Payne before beginning his valiant yet extraordinarily pushy time at the college. This is where Brother John Payne met Dr. Joseph Sear. Winter in the small town of Alfred
The
was
real
a
Dr.
cozy
Joseph.
affair, with snow hedging in the inhabitants for months at a time. The two became fast friends, chatting about all sorts of subjects, medical information especially, growing closer over time. As John neared the end of his probationary period with the college, Joe asked him if he could do him a favor. Brother John was American, and as a Canadian, Joe needed help to acquire the right papers to get a license to practice medicine in the United States. Give me your records and credentials, and I can, doctor. All of them. The more, the quicker, said Brother John, and soon he had a stack of papers weighing nearly a pound altogether. Soon after, a notice was posted announcing the staff assignments for the new college. Unfortunately, to the intense chagrin of Brother John, he was not put in charge of the college, nor was he given the head of a department. He was merely a biology teacher. Expanding the college into a 4-year program was his idea. How could they pass him up? In a rage over being ignored, he stormed off to his room to begin packing. On his way out, he noticed a bottle of wine used for mass, and, in a fit of anger, drank the entire bottle in 2 swift gulps, all in front of a bewildered colleague.
He stole the mass wine.
Then, the soon-to-be former member of the college stomped out the front door, where he saw another colleague sitting in a station
identities?
wagon. Did they fix it yet? Asked Brother John. Fix what? Said the young man in the driver's seat. That whirring noise, like the transmission is about to explode, replied John. I'll race the motor for you. The brother in the car immediately ejected himself from the vehicle, while John plopped himself in the driver's seat and turned the engine. Tell them this. Say I hope their rotten college will prove such a failure that the crash will be heard all the way into the Vatican. Now look out. And with that, Brother John sped off into the night, leaving behind the school he regarded as his own, and a baffled brotherhood bewildered by the boldest burglary they had ever beheld. Outside of Lawrence, Massachusetts, there is a hand-painted sign. It reads, Welcome to Lawrence.
Pretty crazy.
Our motto, see Dante's Inferno, Canto 3. Line 9. If we look it up, we find the passage, All hope abandon, ye who enter here, the mythological words resting above the entrance to hell. If you were very lucky, you might have seen the lurching figure of a stray 29-year-old hauling up a dark sign outside a hometown he always dreamed of outgrowing. Almost 30 years before Brother John sped off into the distance, a boy was born to a French-Canadian father and an Irish-American mother in the little town of Lawrence, just outside Boston, on December 12, 1921. As the first male son of the family, his father was elated to finally have an heir and treated his son as such. The boy was named after his father, becoming Ferdinand Waldo Demara Jr. And on the day of his 4th birthday, dear old dad announced boldly to all present that, beginning tonight, he is to be called Mr. Demara. To an applauding audience, young Ferdinand, going by Fred, stepped onto a table, fetched a handful of roses, and gave one to each of the family's servants. Such was Fred's pseudo-aristocratic upbringing, and it reflected in his vision of himself. However, the nouveau riche lifestyle became more difficult to uphold as his family's wealth declined during the Great Depression. Young Fred hated the look of patched shoes, seeing them as an insult to his station. In the coming years, Fred left home to join a monastery of Trappist monks. He moved around a bit with the Brothers of Charity, another monkhood where he taught 4th grade. Eventually, he got into an argument with the head brother, stole a car, some money, and ran off to join the army. It was 1941. Now, as it turns out, war is a pain in the rear at best and a death trap at worst. Not at all the kind of place a formerly wealthy boy born with a silver spoon in his mouth could make a name for himself. It wasn't all bad, however. Aside from parades in the early morning, calisthenics, and the possibility of being sent to fight in an actual real-world war, Fred made some friends while he was there. One day, while in Anthony's hometown of New Orleans, the duo went to his childhood home to meet his mother, who took out a box full of mementos and documents outlining Anthony's life. Anthony thought that his friend Fred would die of boredom looking over his old papers. But Fred was enthralled. He pored over his friend's documents. What do you see in those things? Anthony asked. I see a whole life ahead of me, Fred replied. A few weeks later, after sanding down a blister on his heel until it bled in order to get out of marching orders, Fred snuck out using a forged day pass and took the bus down to New Orleans. Surprising Anthony's mother, he appeared at her front doorstep, saying he wanted to take a look at his friend's papers again. He pored over the little box of documents until late in the night. Anthony's mother left for bed, and in the morning, all she found was a note thanking her for her kindness, and the box containing her son's life back in his room where it belonged. Luckily for Fred, she didn't bother checking to see if there was anything left inside. If you'd asked him why he did it, Fred would have been very clear. He hated the army. He was still wanted for car theft, and the only way to get out of his responsibilities was to become someone else.
Yeah,
and become someone else he did. and he did so over
Just kept doing
and
it
over.
over and over again.
First, under the guise of Anthony Agnolia, he joined the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Then, after being caught in a lie, he bolted for New Mellery Abbey near Dubuque, Iowa. Shortly after that, he returned home, where his father chastised him for deserting the army
he's just
in a
like
time
straight
of war,
identity theft.
a capital offense.
That's
Instead of turning
wild.
himself in like a good boy, Fred joined the Navy, hoping to quickly rise through the ranks as a medical officer. However, despite doing well through basic training, he was rejected for advanced medical training because he didn't have the right education. So, once more, Fred made his
He
plans
just
to
lied it
escape
up again.
military service. After doctoring documents, scamming officials for school transcripts, and collecting the appropriate paperwork, he strolled down to the docks and left a note on the side of the water,
Well, it's
begging
crazy how
forgiveness,
far
hoping
he
that his
got.
former
How many
comrades
times he
would
got to
assume
do
he
this?
drowned. Fred
I mean, it said he
Waldo
got
Demara
caught, but he
was
moved
dead,
away.
and now only Dr. Robert Linton
He was
French,
selling identities for
PhD in
time.
psychology, was left. Fred worked under French's name for as long as he could, bouncing around different Christian colleges, doing sundry work, teaching and cooking here and there. Unfortunately for Fred, however, he was caught by military police in 1945 and imprisoned for desertion.
Oh.
Lucky for him, his original sentence of 6 years was cut down to 18 months for good behavior.
So he was cut.
After being released
But he
from
just
prison,
did it again?
Fred got a job working nights at the Massachusetts General Eye and Ear Infirmary. This was a dream come true, as now he had unabashed access to the infirmary's mailroom, and he quickly set about to create a new identity.
Right.
Fred had heard about Dr. Cecil Boyce Heyman on the bus and thought he was as good
Straight
a
in the
man
hospital,
as
so he
any
has a
to
lot
be.
of choices
Fred forged
to
the
choose.
signatures of doctors who worked at the
A lot of
clinic
options.
and used office stationery to acquire Dr. Cecil's credentials. So now, with all the documents he needed, he set off for Northeastern Law School in Boston. From here, we know some of the story. Fred, under Dr. Cecil's name, joined the Brothers of Christian Instruction, met Dr. Joseph Sear, and acquired his
Right.
documents before speeding off into the night. We also know that after that, Fred, now as Dr. Joseph Sear, joined the Canadian Navy and met the love of his life, Catherine, on that sunny day in Halifax. Many have purported that Demara had a photographic memory and a genius-level IQ. After only a frantic reading of the medical textbooks he had in his fraudulently acquired office,
yeah, he did
was
that,
able
and he got to steal
successfully perform
identities
dental
pretty
work,
fast.
open chest surgery,
Had to
and
go through a bunch
litany
of
other
documents.
life-threatening injuries.
like he was pretty good at
Whether or not
reading.
he truly possessed an exceptional brain is hard to confirm. What isn't, however, is that no matter what identity he was wearing, Fred Waldo Demara was no doubt a master of charisma. After the news of Dr. Joseph
that thing at
Sear was an
100.
imposter, the authorities came for Fred quickly. He was transferred into the custody of another Navy vessel and immediately shipped back to Canada, where he was interrogated, still claiming to be a surgeon who, for one reason or another, had to enter the Canadian Navy under a false identity. The Royal Canadian Navy, not wanting to embarrass itself and learning that a man with no medical knowledge whatsoever had somehow infiltrated their ranks, performing over a dozen surgeries, all successful, discharged him at once, hoping that with his departure, all memory of this humiliation would fade. After Fred returned home to America, nursing the wound of being captured, he sold his life story to Life magazine, who regaled the world with the exploits of Ferdinand Waldo Demara, the great imposter. It did little to help him feel better, and eventually he turned more and more to drink.
Oh.
He took on odd jobs here and there under this or that disguise, but by 1957, as he taught at a local school in Maine, he was recognized from his story in life and arrested by the FBI on February 14th. Fortunately, he was only arrested on charge of not having a teaching license.
Man's face seems
and
like it was
given
everywhere.
2 months probation.
Just a matter
in
of time.
1960, he was cast in a film called
In a movie.
Hypnotic Eye, in which he learned he was a terrible, god-awful actor, despite acting basically his entire life. And in the same year, Robert Crichton wrote a
something?
biography on him. From then to the time of his death on June 7th, 1981, Fred lived in relative obscurity, his newfound fame putting a stop to the majority of his cons and grifts. Looking back at what he did, he defines it as pure rascality. He never saw Catherine again. His medical degree might have been fake, but his love was definitely a surgeon.
Surgeon. Well, that was absolutely crazy. This man was straight stealing multiple identities and performed 16 surgeries in one day. Those are some wild moves he was making. This is absolutely crazy.